They say the West was built on grit and gunpowder, but every now and then it was held together by something quieter, a choice no one saw coming. 20 winters ago, Miriam Cole was just a school teacher in a dust-bitten town. Not young, not married, not the sort of woman anyone noticed unless she was in the way. But that day she stepped forward, stepped between the sheriff's whip and a poor widow with 5 trembling boys at her side. 10 lashes meant for someone else fell across her back instead. She didn't speak. She didn't flinch. She just walked away, the snow swallowing her steps. The next morning, the town went back to its business. No one asked her why. No one thanked her. And Miriam, she never told a soul. Years passed. The widow moved on. The boys grew into men scattered to the far edges of the frontier. And Miriam kept teaching mending, surviving, carrying her quiet act of mercy like a folded letter in the pocket of her heart. Until one morning, deep in another hard winter, the schoolhouse door burst open, and in walked 5 men, broad-shouldered, weathered faces dusted with snow. They said nothing at first. Then the eldest stepped forward. "Our mother told us," he said. "She told us what you did." Before Miriam could speak, all 5 of them dropped to their knees, not like beggars, but like men honoring a soldier. Snowflakes clung to their coats as the eldest placed a leather pouch in her hands. It was heavy with gold. Payment, they said, for a debt they could never repay. But Miriam pushed it back. "I didn't do it for this," she whispered. "We know," another said. "That's why we can't let you be alone anymore." And from the back of the room, a man named Elias Ward, steady-eyed, quiet as the mountains watched the scene unfold. Maybe he had been waiting for this moment. Or maybe the West had just decided that it owed Miriam Cole something after all. Because some wounds never fade, but sometimes kindness comes back wearing the faces of the people you once saved. Why did Miriam take those lashes that day? What happened between her and Elias after the widow's sons returned? And how can one act of mercy change the course of a life even 20 years later? Stay with me. The answers are in the story you're about to hear, a story about pain carried in silence, and the kind of love and gratitude that arrive not when you ask, but when you've almost stopped hoping. Mornings in Red Mesa started like an old stove, slow to catch heat, building quiet and steady, and not everyone had the patience to tend the fire. Miriam Cole, 50 years old, stepped down from the wooden porch of the general store, a basket of bread in her arms, bread she'd traded for a few scoops of coffee beans. Her back was broad, her shoulders carrying more than one woman's share over a lifetime. Silver threaded through her hair at the temples, braided not for beauty, but because dignity needs to stand tall. On the courthouse board, a notice flapped in the wind: Ruth Talley sentenced to 10 lashes for late payment of land tax by order of Judge Henry Crail. Passers-by read it, then let their eyes slide away. In Red Mesa, silence was sometimes the safest side to take. Miriam lingered. Ruth was a widow with 5 sons. One bitter winter, when Abel Cole, Miriam's husband, a man who believed authority was something you could wield like a whip, had walked out, it was Ruth who kept her alive with bowls of thin porridge and hot claws against her fevered brow. Now Ruth stood in the square wrists, bound, spine-straight gaze fixed somewhere far off. Her eldest boy struggled to get to her, but 2 deputies held him back. Miriam set her basket down, stepped into the ring of onlookers. Her voice was calm, but fixed like a fence post driven deep. "The law says there must be 10 lashes. The law doesn't say who has to take them." Crail's mouth tightened. "This isn't your affair." "She's a mother," Miriam said, "and I've got a back strong enough. I'll take her place." A ripple of murmurs moved through the crowd, then fell still. Miriam walked to the post, did not kneel, simply placed her palms on the rough wood. The young soldier holding the whip hesitated, meeting her eyes, saw no fear there, only the silent words, "Go on, I can bear it." The first lash burned across her back. The second, she bit down on her breath. By the 5th, the crowd had stopped pretending to look away. By the 10th, the soldier let the whip fall like it had scorched his own hand. Miriam turned to Ruth. "Go home. I'll come by tomorrow to help mend the fence." She picked up her basket and walked away, leaving behind a town that had just seen itself in the mirror. Sometimes all it takes for a town to remember what it is one back that stands steady in the right place. The morning light in Red Mesa was thin, almost shy, as though the sun itself wasn't sure it belonged there. Frost clung to the troughs outside the livery, and the air carried that brittle quiet that follows a public shaming. When Miriam Cole stepped out of her small clapboard house, every movement was deliberate. She'd slept, sitting up unable to lie flat because of the whip marks across her back. Her shirt stuck in places, but she didn't make a sound as she reached for her shawl. At the end of the dirt road, Ruth Talley was waiting, not close enough to intrude, just standing there with her hands wrapped in her apron. Her eyes were red from crying, though she'd likely done it where no one could see. The five boys hovered behind her like restless shadows, tall, short, lanky, freckled, each carrying something in their hands. A bundle of wood, a sack of beans, a jar of honey, offerings of a kind. "Mornin'," Ruth said, her voice soft. "Mornin'," Miriam replied, pulling her shawl tighter. No one mentioned the lashes, not directly. Ruth just stepped forward and, without asking, reached for the basket in Miriam's hand. "You shouldn't be carrying weight today," Miriam held her gaze, "and you shouldn't have to stand alone in that square." One by one, the boys stepped forward. The eldest, Caleb, knelt first, setting down his bundle of wood at her feet. Then the others followed Isaac. Luke, Ben, and little Thomas, who was barely 8, holding that jar of honey like it was gold. Not a word was spoken, but the gesture was loud enough to fill the street. From a porch across the way, Sheriff Whit Danner watched his coffee cooling in his hand. And further down the road, a man in a dark coat leaned against a hitching post, his hat pulled low. His eyes never left Miriam. She didn't notice him, not yet. Sometimes the people who see you first aren't the ones you expect. The wind picked up by mid-morning, tugging at skirts and rattling the tin sign above Weaver's Mercantile. Miriam Cole kept her head low as she crossed the street, but she could feel it, that prickle on the back of her neck. Someone was watching. She glanced once, quick and cautious. The man in the dark coat was still there, leaning against the hitching post like he'd been poured into the shadows. Broad shoulders, dust-worn boots, hat brim casting his face in half-light. When she stepped into the Mercantile, the bell over the door jangled. Ruth Talley had followed her in, carrying a list written in a tidy but faded hand. "Need flour, salt, and if there's any, coffee," Ruth murmured. They moved between the narrow aisles in silence until the bell rang again. The man had followed them inside. He didn't browse, didn't greet anyone. Just stood by the counter, his gaze fixed on Miriam. Finally he spoke, low, steady. "You always take beatings meant for other folks." The room stilled. Even Mr. Weaver behind the counter froze, mid-measure sugar spilling in a slow arc. Miriam didn't look up from the bag of beans in her hands. "Sometimes folks don't deserve what's coming to them." "Sometimes," he said, "neither do you." Her eyes met his, then sharp, searching, and something in her chest shifted. There was no pity in his gaze, no judgment, just the kind of seeing that made you feel weighed and measured, yet not found lacking. He tipped his hat. "Name's Elias Ward. Guess I'll be seeing you around." And then he was gone, leaving the door to swing on its hinges and the cold air to pour in after him. Ruth leaned closer, whispering, "You know him." Miriam shook her head, but the truth was, his voice felt like a memory she couldn't quite place. Some people step into your life like they've been walking toward you for years. That night the wind howled against the eaves of Ruth Talley's small cabin. Miriam Cole sat at the table mending a shirt that wasn't hers, a man's shirt torn along the sleeve. She didn't ask where it came from. She knew better than to ask too many questions in this town. The fire popped and Ruth looked up from her knitting. "That man today, Elias Ward, he's trouble." Miriam tied off her stitch. "You know him, knew of him. Rode with the Texas Cattle Company years back. Folks say he walked away after something went wrong on the Brazos. Nobody knows what, and those who do, don't tell." Miriam didn't reply, but her fingers slowed. Something in her wanted to believe that his steady gaze meant more than idle curiosity. Yet in this town, men who carried secrets often carried trouble too. The next day, she found out how right Ruth was. She'd gone to the well to draw water when 3 men from the saloon cornered her, not with leers, but with questions. "What's Ward want with you?" one asked, his breath sour with whiskey. "Man like that don't give without getting another added." Miriam straightened, meeting their eyes one by one. "If you've got something to say about him, say it to his face, not mine." One of them smirked. "Maybe we will." That evening, as she walked back from the schoolhouse, she saw them again, only this time Elias Ward was with them. They stood in a half circle by the hitching rail, the tension in the air sharp enough to cut. She couldn't hear the words, but she saw the moment it shifted Elias's jaw, tightening his hand, flexing like he was holding back the urge to reach for something more than words. When the three men finally stalked off, Elias caught sight of her. "You shouldn't be walking home alone after dark," he said, voice low but firm. "I've been walking home alone for years," she answered. "Yeah," he said, "and it shows." She didn't know if it was an insult or a truth too close to the bone. Sometimes the people you want to trust are the very ones the town warns you about. The next morning the air was sharp with frost, each breath curling like smoke in the early light. Miriam Cole was sweeping the porch of the schoolhouse when she heard boots behind her. She didn't need to turn. Elias Ward had a way of moving that was quiet but heavy, like a man used to entering rooms where he wasn't welcome. "I owe you something," he said. She kept sweeping. "You don't owe me a thing." "Yes, I do," he said, and his voice wasn't the flat tone she'd grown used to. It was rougher, the kind of rough that comes when a man's been carrying a weight too long. Finally, she set the broom aside and faced him. "Then say it plain." He took a step closer, hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat. "5 years ago in a town called Red Butte, I was laid up in the jail with a busted leg. I watched through the bars while they tied a poor widow to the post for a debt she couldn't pay." Miriam's grip tightened on the porch rail. "They said 10 lashes, Elias continued. "And just when the sheriff raised the whip, you stepped between them. Took every strike yourself. Didn't cry. Didn't beg. Just stood there." Her throat tightened. She had worked hard to bury that day, to keep it locked away where no one could touch it. "You never even looked back at me," he said. "But I never forgot your face." For a moment all she could hear was the memory, the whip's whistle, the sting, the gasps from the crowd. She had done it because the widow had 5 boys and no one else in the world. She hadn't known there was a man in the jail watching. She swallowed hard. "And what is it you think you owe me?" "Not debt," he said. "A choice. You can keep walking alone, or you can let someone stand between you and the next whip." She shook her head, half angry, half afraid. "And when you get tired of standing," his gaze didn't waver, "then I'll still be here." The wind stirred, carrying the smell of wood smoke from the cabins down the street. Miriam felt the years of guarded solitude pressing against this single moment, a moment that might crack it open or seal it shut forever. Some debts aren't paid in coin. They're paid in staying. The first snow came early that year, soft flakes drifting over the roofs like sifted flour. The town grew quieter, boots crunching in the drifts, the river freezing at its shallow edges. Miriam Cole had planned, as always, to winter alone, a few cords of wood stacked behind her cabin, sacks of flour and beans tucked under the bed. Solitude was safer. Loneliness hurt less than disappointment. But Elias Ward didn't give her the choice. One evening she returned from the schoolhouse to find her porch stacked high with fresh split kindling. No note, no knock, just the work done. The next night there was a cured ham hanging by the door. After that, a pair of wool-lined gloves, the kind you couldn't buy in town. She tried to return them. "I don't take charity," she told him the next time he appeared at her gate. He only shrugged. "Good thing I'm not offering it." Slowly his presence began to slip into her days, not in grand gestures, but in the way the barn door stopped creaking because he'd oiled the hinges, or how the well bucket never froze over because he knocked the ice loose before she woke. The barrier she had built over decades, a fortress of silence and self-reliance, began to crack. Not from pressure, but from warmth. One bitter night when the wind howled hard enough to shake the shutters, there was a knock on her door. She opened it to find Elias, snow caught in his beard, holding a pot of venison stew. "You can eat alone," he said, stepping inside without waiting, "or you can let me tell you the story of the dumbest horse I ever owned." She should have sent him away. She didn't. By the time the stew was gone, the fire had burned low, and the silence between them felt different. Not the heavy kind she had always known, but the still kind, like a quilt laid over a sleeping child. Miriam sat back in her chair, watching the shadows move across his face. For the first time in years, she realized she wasn't bracing herself for the moment someone would leave. And maybe she didn't have to. Some winters, the thaw begins long before spring. It happened on a morning so cold the air itself seemed to crack. Miriam Cole was at the schoolhouse early, coaxing the stove to life, when the door burst open and the wind carried in 5 broad-shouldered men. She froze, a piece of kindling still in her hand. She knew those faces not from now, but from 20 years ago. The widow's boys. Back then they had been skinny and frightened, their mother clinging to them as the sheriff's man prepared the whipping post. The sentence had been hers, 10 lashes for an unpaid debt, until Miriam had stepped forward, taken the blows herself, and walked away without a word. They had been too young to understand then, but they had remembered. The eldest, a man with dark hair streaked in silver, stepped forward. "Ma passed this winter," he said quietly. "She told us everything." His voice caught rough with cold and something heavier. Before she could speak, all 5 of them dropped to one knee in the snow. Not like beggars, like men honoring a soldier. "You saved her," the eldest said. "You saved us. We never knew how to thank you." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. Inside was enough gold to last her the rest of her days. Miriam's eyes blurred, not from the wind. She pushed the pouch back toward him. "I didn't do it for this." "We know," another brother said, his breath clouding the air. "That's why we can't let you be alone anymore." From the doorway behind her, Elias Ward appeared, his gaze moving from their faces to hers. "Guess the thaw came early this year," he murmured. For the first time in decades, Miriam Cole didn't feel like a woman surviving the winter. She felt like a woman stepping into spring. Because some debts aren't measured in money, they're paid in love, returned in doors left open and in hands that pull you up when the world thinks you've fallen. And sometimes the kindness you give away comes back when you're finally ready to receive it. That winter, the snow lay deep on the prairie, soft and unbroken, like a clean page. Miriam Cole had lived through 50 years of hard seasons, most of them without anyone standing beside her. She had learned to make peace with silence, to accept that some debts are never paid and some kindnesses are never returned. But that year, something shifted. The widow's 5 sons didn't just visit once. They kept coming, chopping her wood, fixing her roof, sitting at her table. And Elias Ward, the quiet man who had stood in the back that first day, began walking her home from church. Not because she needed protection, but because he wanted to hear her talk about the things that mattered: the scent of lilacs in spring, the way a child's handwriting changes as they grow, the sound of wind through winter grass. It turned out that kindness, like seeds scattered years before, had been taking root all along. And now in the coldest months, it had bloomed. Maybe that's the thing worth remembering. We can't always see what our small acts will become. But if we keep showing up with open hands, the harvest will come often in ways we never imagined. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who might need a little hope today. And tell me in the comments, would you like to see what happens next for Miriam and Elias, or hear more stories like this one?